Hey, we're going to continue Rebbe Noson's biography, The Life of Reb Noson of Breslov, Through Fire and Water, and we're up to chapter 7. The sack. The round trip to Berdichev took about a week, and Reb Noson returned home to Nemirov at the end of October. It took him a few days to sort and price the merchandise. After some 10 days of intense business activity, Reb Noson bemoaned the precious hours he had lost eternally. He decided he needed at least a few hours with the Rebbe in order to unburden his heart. Reb Noson left for Breslov without informing his family. His wife used to sit in the store the whole day. She would make a note of any purchases made on credit or deposits placed, and she used to check the inventory. Normally, Reb Noson would spend the entire day learning in the Beis Medrash, while in the evening he would do the bookkeeping. But when Esther Shendel returned home that day, Reb Noson was not there. Thinking he was delayed in the Beis Medrash, she went to look for him. Not seeing him there, she understood where he had gone and was extremely upset. When Reb Noson came to the Rebbe, he told him about his loss of standing in the eyes of leading members of the Nemirov community. The Rebbe responded by showing him a lesson he had given some years earlier when someone in Medvedevka had complained about his loss of status. The lesson explains how intense concentration in one's Torah study has the power to enhance one's standing. Reb Noson mentioned to the Rebbe that even though his wife was attending to the store, he had to see to the accounts every day. What? Said the Rebbe. Every night you must make accounts and spend so much time on worldly matters? Once a week should be enough. Your main accounting should be to prepare for the world to come, Olam Haba. This was all Reb Noson needed to hear. He already yearned to devote his entire time to Torah study and prayer. From now on, he decided he would see to all his accounts on Saturday nights and no more. On his return home, Esther Shendel was not at all pleased to find out about his new attitude towards the business. She began to wonder about the change in her husband. Even before he went to Rebbe Nachman, Reb Noson had been a diligent masmid, but now he was studying more than ever. He slept no more than 4 hours a day. Every moment was spent in Torah. He wouldn't even engage in simple conversations. Everything was Torah, more Torah, only Torah. Once, when Reb Noson was asked how he could get along with so little sleep, he replied, I do everything very fast by nature. Even my sleep is fast. But what bothered Esther Shendel was that it seemed that all Reb Noson's devotions were at the expense of his family and financial responsibilities. It was in early November that Reb David Tzvi Orbach finally arrived in Nemirov. As soon as he heard that Reb Noson had become a Breslov Chassid, he began toying with the idea of a divorce for the couple. With Reb Noson almost totally shirking his financial obligations, Esther Shendel had already thought the same. And even Reb Noson's father advised her to ask for a divorce. But then Reb David Tzvi asked her, does Reb Noson still study Torah? Much more than before, she replied. If he's studying Torah, he said, then do not divorce him. However, the strains were still there, and indeed worsening day by day. Reb Noson was forced to relent somewhat, and in order to ease the tensions, an agreement was made, whereby he would cut down on his journeys to Breslov and travel to buy merchandise from time to time. One day, Reb Noson was praying, but no matter how hard he tried, he found it impossible to concentrate. It was hard to accept that just a few miles away lived someone who could enlighten him. Yet because of his family's opposition, he was unable to go to him. Reb Noson decided to journey to Breslov early that afternoon in the hope of being able to speak to the Rebbe and return home the same evening. But there was a heavy downpour of rain and he was delayed. When Reb Noson finally came to the Rebbe said to him, to you, we must say, Shalom Aleichem, Tzeichem L'Shalom. Hello and goodbye. To keep the opposition to a minimum. The Rebbe then said, one must go after the truth. One must search for it, seek it, wherever the truth might be. The Rebbe then taught him a lesson about how truth is the key to concentration in prayer. When a person tries to pray, he feels hemmed in by all kinds of alien thoughts and emotions, making it impossible for the words of his prayer to rise to Hashem. But when he comes to the truth, it is as if God's own light is clothed in him, because truth is God's seal, and he could find plenty of openings to escape his inner darkness and exile. The Torah portion that week was Noach, And the Rebbe showed how all the ideas in his lesson were related to the light Noach was told to make in the ark. The Rebbe said, anyone with sense and understanding should pray all his days to be able to say one word to God with absolute truth, even just once in his life. Reb Noson then went home. 2 weeks passed, and Reb Noson again went to Rebbe Nachman. He told the Rebbe that he now only did the accounts on Saturday nights. The Rebbe sighed and said, who knows what Eliyahu Hanavi would say? You have to do your accounts every Saturday night. Perhaps you can make do with it once a month. Time is very short, said the Rebbe. It flies by very quickly. Before a person realizes it, his life is behind him. Make use of your time to serve God. Esther Shendel was beside herself. Esther Shendel was beside herself over the fact that Reb Noson would not attend to the bookkeeping more than once a month. She poured out her heart to Reb Noson's father, who was extremely angry and made his feelings quite clear to his son. But Reb Noson was steadfast in his determination to follow the Rebbe's advice. He wanted to spend his entire life serving God. His friends and relatives needled him again and again. How can you be so cruel to yourself and your family? You must earn a living. But Reb Noson was so heavily immersed in his Torah study and devotions that he did not even have time to listen to them. On Friday, Rosh Chodesh Kislev, Esther Shendel gave birth to a boy. This is November 26th, 1802. The bris took place the following Friday, and the boy was named Shachna. A few days after the bris, Reb Noson again traveled to the Rebbe and spent 3 weeks there until after Hanukkah. It was during this period that Reb Noson began transcribing Rebbe Nachman's lessons. He had already written down the lessons he had heard until now for his own use, but from this time on, he recorded the Rebbe's teachings more formally. Rebbe Nachman would read a paragraph or so in Yiddish, and Reb Noson would then write it down in Hebrew. At the end of a session, Reb Noson would usually read the whole lesson back to the Rebbe. Reb Noson felt that the 3 weeks he spent with the Rebbe and the Torah he heard on Shabbos Chanukah inspired him with Ruach HaKodesh. Reb Noson once said, on a winter Friday night, one can attain levels that can be reached on Kol Nidre night. In the winter, the nights are long, and one can serve God the whole night. On Shabbos night, the thirst for God is tremendous. Reb Nachman of Tolchin, who was Reb Noson's closest follower, said, the reason Reb Noson received more from the Rebbe than any of his other followers was because of those long winter Friday nights. The Rebbe would reveal awesome teachings on Friday evenings, and everybody would feel an arousal to God. But afterwards, they went to sleep. Reb Noson, however, because of his burning desire for spirituality, used to go to the hills along the Bug River and pray the entire night, asking that the Rebbe's blazing fire should kindle his heart. He would then pray with tremendous devotion on Shabbos morning, especially when saying the Nishmas prayer. It was through these devotions that he attained such great levels. While some of the Rebbe's followers paid heed only when he was giving over his lessons, Reb Noson used to listen to every single word the Rebbe said, even if it was a seemingly mundane conversation. As our sages teach, even the simple conversations of the tzaddikim require study. That's the Gemara in Avodah Zarah. Reb Noson once said that this was one of the main ways he came to know Rebbe Nachman. Reb Noson also said, with every word from the Rebbe, I lost my power of free choice. Perhaps the most difficult accomplishment for one as brilliant as Reb Noson was that from the time he first came to the Rebbe, he set aside his own ideas completely. He heard one sentence from Rebbe Nachman, he had one drop of intelligence. He heard a second teaching from the Rebbe, he had a second drop of knowledge. The Breslov Chassidic said this was why Reb Noson received more from the Rebbe than his other followers, great as they each were individually. While the others recognized Rebbe Nachman as their leader and the central figure in their lives, they still held somewhat to their own ideas. Reb Noson, on the other hand, opened himself to the Rebbe unreservedly. He looked on himself as being totally dependent on the Rebbe's guidance, as the moon is totally dependent on the sun for its light. When Reb Noson complained about the obstacles and barriers he faced, the Rebbe said, I've caught you in my sack. Reb Noson replied, tie it tighter so I can't escape. When Reb Noson returned to Nemirov in late December after Hanukkah, his wife threw the keys of the store at him, saying she was no longer interested in operating a store where all the responsibility fell on her shoulders. Reb Noson's father added to his troubles by telling him he was not going to support him anymore, and he threw him out of the house. In addition, he confiscated Reb Noson's entire dowry, a sum of about 2,000 rubles, refusing to return the money under any circumstances. Esther Shendel remained in her father-in-law's house, while Reb Noson was forced to go to the home of his grandfather, Reb Yitzchak Danzig, who was, at least for the time being, supportive. None of this had any effect on Reb Noson, and he gave himself over to his devotions with all his heart. He threw himself into his studies and prayed with ever greater intensity. He had wanted a private room where he could study and practice his bodhidus without being disturbed. This had been impossible in his father's home, but his grandfather's house was fairly large, and he could usually find the private corner. Esther Shendel traveled to her father, Reb David Tzvi, in Kremenetz, and complained bitterly about Reb Noson's behavior. Reb David Tzvi feared that Reb Noson had turned to Chassidus as a devotional path that took him away from his studies. From the time he became a Breslov Chassid, he asked, "Does he still learn?" "What can I say?" replied Esther Shendel. "Ever since he started traveling to Rebbe Nachman, he studies double, even triple what he did before. He never stops, day or night." Reb David Tzvi replied, "If Reb Noson has taken the yoke of Torah upon himself with such diligence, you must do everything in your power to share his burden." "But what about Parnassa?" she asked. "With such a husband, you ask for Parnassa?" Reb David Tzvi said. "Put your nose in the street in order to support him. Take a sack of salt, sit in the market and sell it, but support him." Reb David Tzvi loved Torah. When he heard how Rebbe Nachman instilled in Reb Noson such a love of Torah, he said, somewhat surprisingly, "Such a Rebbe, one must think." Esther Shendel was bothered, even furious, at much of Reb Noson's behavior. She was being forced into carrying a burden that was unthinkable at the time of her marriage. Yet, as much as she resented Reb Noson's changes in attitude, her upbringing in Rebbe David Tzvi's house gave her an understanding of the life of a Torah scholar, and in some ways, she saw in Reb Noson a man who, like her father, was entirely devoted to the Torah and its values. Esther Shendel thus returned to Nemirov a little mollified after her father's admonition. However, Reb Noson's father was still angry with him, to the point that an intestinal illness from which he suffered became more acute. Reb Noson was forced to remain in his grandfather's house. His grandfather said to him, "Why do you cause your father such aggravation?" But this did not stop Reb Noson, who visited the Rebbe again a little before Rosh Chodesh Shvat, January 24th, 1803. Reb Nachman's uncle, Reb Baruch of Mezhebizh, was visiting Tolchin near Breslov at the time. Rebbe Nachman went to visit him there, and Reb Noson accompanied him. Soon afterwards, the Rebbe left for a trip to the Teravitsa, Medvedevka, and Shirin region to visit his Hasidim. The wedding of his daughter Sarah to Reb Yitzchak Isaac, the son of Reb Leib Dubrovner, would also be taking place during the trip. Reb Noson, together with some of the Rebbe's other followers, accompanied him as far as Linitz, where Reb Gedalia of Linitz received them with great warmth. Reb Noson did not know that the Rebbe was planning to remain in Medvedevka until after Pesach, and he returned to Nemirov. When he arrived home, he heard that the Rebbe's wife had ordered certain cakes from Nemirov to take to Medvedevka for her daughter's wedding, which was set for Rosh Chodesh Nisan. Reb Noson realized that the Rebbe would be away from Breslov for a long time and would probably not return until after Pesach. In the few months since he had come to the Rebbe, Reb Noson had tasted such sweetness that he could not imagine being separated from him for so long. He felt he must travel to Medvedevka. However, the distance was considerable, nearly 200 miles. He was afraid he would not be able to reach home again in time for Pesach, and he wondered if he would ever be allowed back into his house if he went. At first, he thought of taking one of his wife's expensive head coverings as a security. However, Reb Lipa advised against this, saying, "If you take it, she'll be embarrassed to go to shul without it. A divorce will certainly follow. Better to have trust in God." Reb Noson was very thankful to Reb Lipa and heeded his advice. Then Reb Noson had another idea. In Berdichev, he had an aunt, his mother's sister, who was wealthy and had a few stores. She had great respect for Reb Noson. She was childless and treated him like a son. She had often asked him to check her books and workers and was willing to give him financial support. Until now, Reb Noson had avoided this because of his desire to devote himself to spirituality. But now he told his family that he was considering traveling to Berdichev for a few weeks. He implied that he would be looking into his aunt's affairs and seeing if the business would suit him. People usually hear what they want to hear, and his family thought this new interest in business was a positive development. His wife and his father were both very pleased. Since it was now the end of Shvat, Reb Noson said he expected to be away until close to Pesach. January and February were usually brutally cold in the Ukraine, with snow and ice making travel very difficult. For the two-day trip from Nemirov to Berdichev, Reb Noson took plenty of warm clothing, generous supplies of food, and his Shabbos clothes, etc., and he left Nemirov with his family's good wishes.